Welcome to Thueringer for Farming Simulator 15. We now return to our reading of Zane Gray's Desert of Wheat, Chapter 14. No, we didn't. Kurt motioned Olson to be silent, as with lifting breast he took an involuntary step forward. Glidden, I know you, he shouted in hard, quick tones. I'm Kurt Dorn. I've met you. I know your voice. Take your game. Get out of here or we'll kill you. This pregnant speech caused a blank, dead silence. Then came a white flash, a sharp report. Kurt heard the thud of a bullet striking someone near him. The man cried out but did not fall. Spread out and hide, ordered Olson, and shoot for keeps. The little crowd broke and melted into the shadows behind and under the boxcars. Kurt crawled under a car and between the wheels, from which vantage point he looked out. Glidden's gang were there in the red glow, most of them now standing. The sentry who had given the alarm still sat on top of the flat car, swinging his legs. His companions, however, had jumped down. Kurt heard men of his own party crawling and whispering behind him, and he saw dim, dark, sprawling forms under the far end of the car. Boss, the hayseeds have run off, called the man from the flat car. Laughter and jeers greeted this sally. Kurt concluded it was about time to begin proceedings. Resting his revolver on the side of the wheel behind which he lay, he took steady aim at the sentry, holding low. Kurt was not a good shot with a revolver, and the distance appeared to exceed 50 yards. But as luck would have it, when he pulled trigger, the sentry let out a loud bawl of terror and pain and fell off the car to the ground. Flopping and crawling like a crippled chicken, he got out of sight below. Kurt's shot was a starter for Olson's men. 4 or 5 of the shotguns boomed at once, then the second barrels were discharged along with a sharper cracking of small arms. Pandemonium broke loose in Glidden's gang. No doubt at least of the effectiveness of the shotguns. A medley of strange, sharp, enraged and anguished cries burst upon the air, a prelude to a wild stampede. In a few seconds, that lighted spot where the IWW had grouped was vacant, and everywhere were fleeing forms, some swift, others slow. So far as Kurt could see, no one had been fatally injured, but many had been hurt, and that fact augured well for Olson's force. Presently a shot came from some hidden enemy. It thudded into the wood of the car over Kurt. Someone on his side answered it, and a heavy bullet striking iron whined away into the darkness. Then followed flash here and flash there, with accompanying reports and whistles of lead. From behind and under and on top of cars opened up a fire that proved how well armed these so-called laborers were. Their volley completely drowned the desultory firing of Olson's squad. Kurt began to wish for one of the shotguns. It was this kind of weapon that saved Olson's followers. There were 100 chances to 1 of missing an IWW with a single bullet, while a shotgun, aimed fairly well, was generally productive of results. Kurt stopped wasting his cartridges. Someone was hurt behind his car, and he crawled out to see. A villager named Schmidt had been wounded in the leg. Not seriously, but bad enough to disable him. He had been using a double-barreled breech-loading shotgun, and he wore a vest with rows of shells in the pockets across the front. Kurt borrowed a gun and ammunition, and with these he hurried back to his covert, grimly sure of himself. At thought of Glidden, he became hot all over, and this heat rather grew with the excitement of battle. With the heavy fowling piece loaded, Kurt peeped forth. from behind his protecting wheel and watched keenly for flashes or moving dark figures. The IWW had begun to reserve their fire, to shift their positions, and to spread out, judging from a wider range of the reports. It looked as if they meant to try and surround Olson's band. It was extraordinary, the assurance and deadly intent of this riffraff gang of tramp labor agitators. In preceding years, a crowd of IWW men had been nothing to worry a rancher. Vastly different it seemed now. They acted as if they had the Great War back in them. Kurt crawled out of his hiding place and stole from car to car in search of Olson. At last he found the rancher in company with several men peering from behind a car. One of his companions was sitting down and trying to wrap something around his foot. "Olson, they're spreading out to surround us," whispered Kurt. "That's what Bill just here said," replied Olson nervously. "If this keeps up, we'll be in a tight place. What'll we do, Dorn?" "We mustn't break and run, of all things," said Kurt. "They'd burn the village. Tell our men to save their shells. If I only could get some cracks at a bunch of them together with this big shotgun." "Say, we've been watching that car, the half-size one there, next to the high box car," whispered Olson. "It's full of them. Sometimes we see a dozen shots come from it all at once." "Olson, I've an idea," returned Kurt excitedly. "You fellas keep shooting. Attract their attention. I'll slip below, climb on top of a boxcar, and get a rake off at that bunch." "It's risky, Dorn," said Olson with hesitation, "but if you could get in a few telling shots, start that gang on the run." "I'll try it," rejoined Kurt, and forthwith stole off back toward the shadow. It struck him that there was more light than when the attack began. The fire had increased, or perhaps the IWW had started another. At any rate, the light was growing stronger, and likewise the danger greater. As he crossed an open space, a bullet whizzed by him, and then another zipped by to strike up the gravel ahead. These were not random shots. Someone was aiming at him. How strange and rage-provoking to be shot at deliberately. What a remarkable experience for a young wheat farmer. Raising wheat in the great Northwest had assumed responsibilities. He had to run, and he was the more furious because of that. Another bullet, flying wide, hummed to his left before he gained the shelter of the farthest line of freight cars. Here he hid and watched. The firing appeared to be all behind him, and thus encouraged, he stole along to the end of the line of the cars and around. A bright blaze greeted his gaze. An isolated car was on fire. Kurt peered forth to make sure of his bearings, and at last found the high derrick by which he had marked the boxcar that he intended to climb. He could see plainly and stole up to his objective point, with little risk to himself until he climbed upon the boxcar. He crouched low, almost on hands and knees, and finally gained the long shadow of a shed between the tracks. Then he ran past the derrick to the dark side of the car. He could now plainly see the revolver flashes and could hear the thud and spang of their bullets striking. Drawing a deep breath, Kurt climbed up the iron ladder on the dark side of the car. He had the same sensation that possessed him when he was crawling to get a pot shot at a flock of wild geese. Only this was mightily more exciting. He did not forget the risk. He lay flat and crawled little by little. Every moment he expected to be discovered. Olson had evidently called more of his men to his side, for they certainly were shooting diligently. Kurt heard a continuous return fire from the car he was risking so much to get a shot at. At length he was within a yard of the end of the car, as far as he needed to go. He rested a moment. He was laboring for breath, sweating freely, on fire with thrills. His plan was to raise himself on one knee and fire as many double shots as possible. Presently, he lifted his head to locate the car. It was half in the bright light, half in the shadow, lengthwise toward him, about 60 or 70 yards distant, and full of men. He dropped his head, tingling all over. It was his disappointment that the car stood so far away. With fine shot, he could not seriously injure any of the IWW contingent, but he was grimly sure of the fright and hurt he could inflict. In his quick glance, he had seen flashes of their guns and many red faces and dark huddled forms. Kurt took 4 shells and set them end up on the roof of the car close to him. Then, cocking the gun, he cautiously raised himself to one knee. He discharged both barrels at once. What a boom and what a terrified outburst of yells. Swiftly he broke the gun, reloaded, fired as before, and then again. The last 2 shots were fired at the men piling frantically over the side of the car, yelling with fear. Kurt had heard the swishing, pattering impact of those swarms of small shot. The IWW gang ran pell-mell down the open track, away from Kurt and toward the light. As he reloaded the gun, he saw men running from all points to join the gang. With an old blunderbuss of a shotgun, he had routed the IWW. It meant relief to Olson's men, but Kurt had yet no satisfaction for the burning of his wheat, for the cruel shock that had killed his father. "Come on, Olson," he yelled at the top of his lungs. "They're a lot of cowards." Then, in his wild eagerness, he leaped off the car. The long jump landed him jarringly, but he did not fall or lose hold of the gun. Recovering his balance, he broke into a run. Kurt was fast on his feet. Not a young man of his neighborhood nor any of his college mates could outfoot him in a race. And then these IWW fellows ran like stiff-legged tramps, long unused to such mode of action, and some of them were limping as they ran. Kurt gained upon these. When he got within range, he halted short and freed 2 barrels. A howl followed the report. Some of the fleeing ones fell, but were dragged up and on by companions. Kurt reloaded and, bounding forward like a deer, yelling for Olson, he ran until he was within range, then stopped to shoot again. Thus he continued until the pursued got away from the circle of light. Kurt saw the gang break up, some running one way and some another. There were sheds and cars and piles of lumber along the track, affording places to hide. Kurt was halted by the discovery that he had no more ammunition. Panting, he stopped short, realizing that he had snapped an empty gun at men either too tired or too furious or too desperate to run any further. "He's out of shells," shouted a low, hard voice that made Kurt leap. He welcomed the rush of dark forms and, swinging the gun round his head, made ready to brain the first antagonist who neared him. But someone leaped upon him from behind. The onslaught carried him to his knees. Bounding up, he broke the gun's stock on the head of his assailant, who went down in a heap. Kurt tried to pull his revolver. It became impossible, owing to strong arms encircling him. Wrestling, he freed himself, only to be staggered by a rush of several men, all pouncing upon him at once. Kurt went down, but once down, he heaved so powerfully that he threw off the whole crew. Up again, like a cat, he began to fight, big and strong and swift, with fists like a blacksmith's. Kurt bowled over this assailant and that one. He thought he recognized Glidden in a man who kept out of his reach and who was urging on the others. Kurt lunged at him and finally got his hands on him. That was fatal for Kurt, because in his fury he forgot Glidden's comrades. In 1 second, his big hand wrenched a yell of mortal pain out of Glidden. Then a combined attack of the others rendered Kurt powerless. A blow on the head stunned him, made all dark. Chapter 15. It seemed that Kurt did not altogether lose consciousness, for he had vague sensations of being dragged along the ground. Presently the darkness cleared from his mind, and he opened his eyes. He lay on his back. Looking up, he saw stars through the thin, broken clouds of smoke. A huge pile of railroad ties loomed up beside him. He tried to take note of his situation. His hands were tied in front of him, not so securely, he imagined, that he could not work them free. His legs had not been tied. Both his head and shoulder on the left side pained him severely. Upon looking around, Kurt presently made out the dark form of a man. He appeared rigid with attention, but that evidently had no relation to Kurt. The man was listening and watching for his comrades. Kurt heard no voices or shots. After a little while, however, he thought he heard distant footsteps on the gravel. He hardly knew what to make of his predicament. If there was only one guard over him, escape did not seem difficult, unless that guard had a gun. "Hello, you," he called. "Hello yourself," replied the man, jerking up in evident surprise. "What's your name?" inquired Kurt amiably. "Well, it ain't A.J. Hill or Anderson," came the gruff response. Kurt laughed. "But you would be one of those names if you could now, wouldn't you?" went on Kurt. "My name is Dennis," gloomily returned the man. "It certainly is. That is the name of all IWW," said Kurt. "Say, are you the fellow who had the shotgun?" "I sure am," replied Kurt. "I ought to knock you on the head." "Why?" "Because I'll have to eat standing up for a month." "Yes?" queried Kurt. "The seat of my pants must have made a good target, for you sure pasted it full of birdshot." Kurt smothered a laugh. Then he felt the old anger leap up. "Didn't you burn my wheat?" "Are you that young Dorn?" "Yes, I am," replied Kurt hotly. "Well, I didn't burn one damn straw of your old wheat." "You didn't, but you're with these men. You're an IWW. You've been fighting these farmers here." "Now, if you want to know, I'm a tramp," said the man bitterly. "Years ago, I was a prosperous oil producer in Ohio. I had a fine oil field. Along comes a big fellow, tries to buy me out, and failing that, he shot off dynamite charges into the ground next to my oil field. Choked my wells, ruined me. I came west, went to farming. Along comes a corporation, steals my water for irrigation, and my land went back to desert. So I quit working and trying to be honest. It doesn't pay. The rich men are all getting richer at the expense of the poor. So now I'm a tramp." "Friend, that's a hard luck story," said Kurt. "It sure makes me think. But I'll tell you what, you don't belong to this IWW outfit, even if you are a tramp." "Why not?" "Because you're American, that's why." "Well, I know I am, but I can be American and travel with a labor union, can't I?" "No, this IWW is no labor union. It never was. Their very first rule is to abolish capital. They're anarchists, and now they're backed by German money. The IWW is an enemy to America. All this hampering of railroads, destruction of timber and wheat is an aid to Germany in the war. The United States is at war. My goodness, man, can't you see that it's your own country that must suffer for such deals as this wheat burning tonight?" "The hell you say?" ejaculated the man in amaze. "If this Glidden is a German agent, perhaps a spy, he's no labor leader. What does he care for the interests of such men as you? Young man, if you don't shut up, you'll give me a hankering to go back to real work." "Well, I hope I do. Let me give you a hunch. Throw down this IWW outfit. Go to Ruxton and get Anderson of Many Waters Ranch to give you a job. Tell him who you are and that I sent you." "Anderson of Many Waters, eh? Well, maybe it'll surprise you to know that Glidden is operating there, has a lot of men there, and is going there from here." "No, it doesn't surprise me. I hope he does go there. For if he does, he'll get killed. whispered the guard. "Here comes some of the gang." Kurt heard low voices and soft footfalls. Some dark forms loomed up. "Bradford, has he come to yet?" queried the brutal voice of Glidden. "Nope," replied the guard. "I guess he had a hard knock. He's never budged." "We've got to beat it out of here," said Glidden. "It's long after midnight. There's a freight train down the track. I want all the gang to board it. You run along, Bradford, and catch up with the others." "What are you going to do with this young fellow?" queried Bradford curiously. "That's none of your business," returned Glidden. "Maybe not, but I reckon I'll ask anyhow. You want me to join your IWW, and I'm asking questions. Labor strike, standing up for your rights, is one thing, and burning wheat or slugging young farmers is another. Are you going to let this corn go?" Kurt could plainly see the group of 5 men, Bradford standing over the smaller Glidden, and the others strung and silent in the intensity of the moment. "I'll cut his throat," hissed Glidden. Bradford lunged heavily. The blow he struck Glidden was square in the face. Glidden would have had a hard fall but for the obstruction in the shape of his comrades upon whom he was knocked. They held him up. Glidden sagged inerrantly, evidently stunned or unconscious. Bradford backed guardedly away out of their reach, and wheeling, he began to run with heavy plodding strides. Glidden's comrades seemed anxiously holding him up, peering at him, but no one spoke. Kurt saw his opportunity. With one strong wrench, he freed his hands. Feeling in his pocket for his gun, he was disturbed to find that it had been taken. He had no weapon, but he did not hesitate. Bounding up, he rushed like a hurricane upon the unprepared group. He saw Glidden's pale face upheld to the light of the stars, and by it saw that Glidden was recovering. With all his might, Kurt swung as he rushed, and the blow he gave the IWW leader far exceeded Bradford's. Glidden was lifted so powerfully against one of his men that they both fell. Then Kurt, striking right and left, beat down the other two, and leaping over them, he bounded away into the darkness. Shrill, piercing yells behind him lent him wings. But he ran right into another group of IWW men, dozens in number, he thought, and by the light of what appeared to be a fire, they saw him as quickly as he saw them. The yells behind were significant enough. Kurt had to turn to run back, and he had to run the gauntlet of the men he had assaulted. They promptly began to shoot at Kurt. The whistle of lead was uncomfortably close. Never had he run so fleetly. When he flashed past the end of the line of cars into comparative open, he found himself in the light of a new fire. This was a shed, perhaps a score of rods or less from the station. Someone was yelling beyond this, and Kurt thought he recognized Jerry's voice. But he did not tarry to make sure. Bullets scattering the gravel ahead of him and singing around his head, and hoarse cries behind him, with a heavy-booted tread of pursuers, gave Kurt occasion to hurry. He flew across the freight yard, intending to distance his pursuers, then circle round the station to the village. Once he looked back. The gang, well spread out, was not far behind him, just coming into the light of a new fire. No one in it could ever catch him. Of that Kurt was sure. Suddenly a powerful puff of air, like a blast of wind, seemed to lift him. At the same instant a dazzling, blinding yellow blaze illuminated the whole scene. The solid earth seemed to rock under Kurt's flying feet, and then a terrific roar appalled him. He was thrown headlong through the air, and all about him seemed streaks and rays and bursts of fire. He alighted to plow through the dirt until the momentum of force had been expended. Then he lay prone, gasping and choking, almost blind, but sensitive to the rain of gravel and debris, the fearful cries of terrified men, taste of smoke and dust, and the rank smell of exploded gasoline. Kurt got up to grope his way through the murky darkness. He could escape now. If that explosion had not killed his pursuers, it had certainly scared them off. He heard men running and yelling off to his left. A rumble of a train came from below the village. Finally, Kurt got clear of the smoke to find that he had wandered off into one of the fields opposite the station. Here he halted to rest a little and to take cognizance of his condition. It surprised him to find out that he was only bruised, scratched, and sore. He had expected to find himself full of bullets. Phew, they blew up the gasoline shed, he soliloquized. But some of them miscalculated, for if I don't lose my guess, there was a bunch of IWW closer to that gasoline than I was. Some adventure. I got another punch at Glidden. I felt it in my bones that I'd get a crack at him. Oh, for another. And that Bradford, he did make me think. How he slugged Glidden. Good, good. There's your old American spirit coming out. Kurt sat down to rest and to listen. He found he needed a rest. The only sound he heard was the rumbling of a train gradually drawing away. A heavy smoke rose from the freight yard, but there were no longer any blazes or patches of red fire. Perhaps the explosion had smothered all the flames. It had been a rather strenuous evening, he reflected. A good deal of satisfaction lay in the fact that he had severely punished some of the IWW members, if he had not done away with any of them. When he thought of Glidden, however, he did not feel any satisfaction. His fury was gone, but in its place was a strong judgment that such men should be made examples. He certainly did not want to run across Glidden again, because if he did, he would have blood on his hands. Kurt's chance meeting with the man Bradford seemed far the most interesting, if not thrilling, incident of the evening. It opened up a new point of view. How many of the men of that motley and ill-governed IWW had grievances like Bradford's? Perhaps there were many. Kurt tried to remember instances when, in the Northwest wheat country, laborers and farmers had been cheated or deceived by men of large interests. It made him grave to discover that he could recall many such instances. His own father had long nursed a grievance against Anderson. Newman, his father's friend, had a hard name, and there were many who had profited by the misfortune of others. That, after all, was a condition of life. He took it for granted then that all members of the IWW were not vicious or dishonest. He was glad to have this proof. The IWW had been organized by labor agitators, and they were the ones to blame, and their punishment should be severest. Kurt began to see where the war, cruel as it would be, was going to be of immeasurable benefit to the country. It amazed Kurt presently to note that dawn was at hand. He waited a while longer, wanting to be sure not to meet any lingering members of the IWW. It appeared, indeed, that they had all gone. He crossed the freight yard. A black ruin, still smoldering, lay where the elevators had been. That wonderful wheat yield of his had been destroyed. In the gray dawn, it was hard to realize. He felt a lump in his throat. Several tracks were littered with the remains of burned freight cars. When Kurt reached the street, he saw men in front of the cottages. Someone hailed him, and several shouted. They met him halfway. Jerry and Olson were in the party. "We was pretty much scared," said Jerry, and his haggard face showed his anxiety. "Boy, we thought the IWW had made off with you," added Olson, extending his hand. "Not much. Where are they?" replied Kurt. "Gone on a freight train. When Jerry blew up the gasoline shed, that fixed the IWW." "Jerry, did you do that?" queried Kurt. "I reckon." "Well, you nearly blew me off the map. I was running just below the shed. When that explosion came, I was lifted and thrown a mile. Thought I'd never light. So far as we can tell, nobody was killed, said Olson. Some of our fellows have got bullet holes to nurse, but no one is bad hurt. Now that's good. I guess we came out lucky, replied Kurt. You must have had some fight running off that way after the IWWs. We heard you shooting and the IWWs yelling. That part was fun. Tell us what happened to you. So Kurt had to narrate his experiences from the time he stole off with the big shotgun until his friends saw him again. It made rather a long story, which manifestly was of exceeding interest to the villagers. Dorn, said one of the men, you and Jerry saved this here village from being burned. And we all had a share. I'm sure glad they're gone. Now what damage was done? It turned out that there had been little hurt to the property of the villagers. Some freight cars full of barley, loaded and billed by the railroad people, had been burned, and this loss of grain would probably be paid for by the company. The loss of wheat would fall upon Kurt. In the haste of that great harvest and its transportation to the village, no provision had been made for loss. The railroad company had not accepted his wheat for transportation and was not liable. Olson, according to our agreement, I owe you $15,000, said Kurt. Yes, but forget it, replied Olson. You're the loser here. I'll pay it, replied Kurt. But boy, you're ruined, ejaculated the farmer. You can't pay that big price now, and we don't expect it.